Picture this. It's 1999, and a former KGB officer who most people had never heard of is about to become Russia's leader. But what you don't know is that he already had a 20-year master plan tucked away. A blueprint so audacious, so carefully crafted, that it would reshape not just Russia, but the entire world order. This isn't some conspiracy theory. This is the documented story of how Vladimir Putin systematically executed one of the most ambitious geopolitical strategies in modern history. You're about to discover how a mid-level intelligence operative transformed himself into one of the world's most powerful leaders, and why understanding his playbook is crucial for every American today. Because whether you realize it or not, this secret plan has been affecting your life for over 2 decades. Let me take you back to December 31st, 1999. Boris Yeltsin, Russia's first president after the Soviet collapse, appears on television looking exhausted and defeated. In a shocking move, he announces his resignation, handing power to his little-known prime minister, Vladimir Putin. Most Western observers dismiss this as just another political shuffle in chaotic post-Soviet Russia. They were dead wrong. What they didn't realize was that Putin had spent years preparing for this moment. During his time in East Germany as a KGB officer, watching the Berlin Wall fall and the Soviet Empire crumble, he had developed what he later called his restoration doctrine. This wasn't just about rebuilding Russia's strength. It was about reclaiming what he saw as Russia's rightful place as a global superpower. Putin's plan had 4 distinct phases, and here's where it gets fascinating. Phase 1 was consolidation of power at home. You see, when Putin took office, Russia was barely functioning. Oligarchs controlled vast chunks of the economy, regional governors acted like independent warlords, and the military was in shambles. But Putin had studied how successful authoritarian leaders throughout history had centralized control, and he was methodical about it. He started with the media. Within 3 years, every major television network was either state-controlled or owned by Putin loyalists. Then came the oligarchs. Remember Boris Berezovsky? He was one of Russia's most powerful business magnates, basically a kingmaker who helped put Putin in power. By 2001, he was fleeing to London in exile. The message was clear. You're either with Putin completely, or you're out. But here's what made Putin different from typical strongmen. He understood that lasting power required more than just fear. He needed legitimacy, and that meant delivering results that Russians could see and feel. This brings us to phase 2 of his master plan, economic reconstruction tied to national pride. Putin got incredibly lucky with timing. Oil prices began a historic surge just as he took power, flooding Russia's treasury with petrodollars. But instead of just pocketing the wealth like previous leaders, he used it strategically. Average Russian salaries increased by 300% during his first decade. Pensions were paid on time. New infrastructure projects sprouted across the country. More importantly, he began crafting a narrative that resonated with ordinary Russians who felt humiliated by their country's post-Soviet weakness. Putin's message was simple but powerful. We are not just recovering, we are returning to greatness. And you know what? For millions of Russians who had lived through the chaos of the 1990s, this message felt true. If you're finding this story as compelling as I am, I'd really appreciate it if you could hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us dive deep into these complex stories that shape our world today. Now, phase 3 is where Putin's plan gets truly remarkable, and frankly, where it starts directly affecting you as an American. This was his international expansion strategy, but not through conventional military conquest. Putin had studied America's rise to global dominance and realized that the 21st century would be won through what experts call hybrid warfare, a combination of economic leverage, information warfare, strategic alliances, and selective military intervention. Let's talk about how brilliantly calculated this was. In 2008, when Russia invaded Georgia, most Western leaders saw it as Putin getting too aggressive, maybe overreaching. But that invasion served multiple purposes in Putin's grand strategy. First, it tested Western resolve and found it lacking. NATO and the EU issued strong statements but took no meaningful action. Second, it sent a message to other former Soviet republics. The West won't protect you when push comes to shove. But the real genius was in how Putin used energy as a weapon. By 2010, Europe was getting about 40% of its natural gas from Russia. This wasn't an accident. It was the result of decades of strategic pipeline construction and energy deals. Suddenly, Putin had leverage over European foreign policy that no Russian leader had possessed since Stalin. Meanwhile, something even more significant was happening that most Americans didn't notice at the time. Putin was building alternative global institutions designed to challenge American-led international order. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization, BRICS, the Eurasian Economic Union. These weren't just trade partnerships. They were the foundation of what Putin called a multipolar world, where America would no longer be the sole global hegemon. Here's where it gets personal for you. Remember the 2016 election? The documented Russian interference wasn't some spontaneous decision. It was part of a systematic campaign that had been years in the making. Putin's strategists had identified America's internal divisions and found ways to amplify them. Social media wasn't just a new technology to them. It was a weapon in their information warfare arsenal. But let's zoom out and see the bigger picture, because this is where Putin's long-term thinking becomes most apparent. He understood that challenging American dominance directly would be suicidal for Russia. Instead, he focused on what strategists call asymmetric warfare, finding ways to impose costs on America and its allies without triggering full-scale conflict. Take Syria, for example. When Putin intervened militarily in 2015, he wasn't just saving Assad's regime. He was establishing Russia as a power broker in the Middle East for the first time since the 1970s. Suddenly, countries that had been firm American allies were hedging their bets, opening channels to Moscow. Putin had turned a civil war most Americans barely understood into a strategic victory that enhanced Russian influence from Iran to Turkey to Israel. This brings us to Phase 4 of Putin's plan, what we might call strategic patience and opportunism. Putin realized early on that America, despite its overwhelming power, had a crucial weakness: short attention spans and frequent changes in political priorities. American presidents come and go every 4 to 8 years, each bringing new foreign policy teams and priorities. But Putin could play the long game. Look at how this played out with NATO expansion. Every American administration since the 1990s has supported bringing former Soviet republics into NATO, seeing it as extending freedom and democracy. But Putin viewed each expansion as an existential threat to Russian security and influence. While American policymakers debated short-term tactics, Putin developed a 20-year strategy to either stop NATO expansion or make it irrelevant. The 2014 annexation of Crimea was a masterclass in this approach. Putin waited until Ukraine was at its weakest, with a new government and a divided society. He moved so quickly and decisively that the West was still trying to understand what was happening when it was already over. And the sanctions that followed? Putin had been preparing Russia's economy for exactly this scenario for years. Here's what's truly remarkable about Putin's strategy. He turned Russia's weaknesses into strengths. Russia's economy is smaller than Italy's, its military budget is a fraction of America's, and its population is declining. But Putin found ways to punch above his weight by being willing to take risks that democratic leaders couldn't, by maintaining consistent long-term strategies across decades, and by exploiting divisions within Western societies. The cyber warfare component is particularly sophisticated. While American politicians debated cybersecurity in terms of protecting infrastructure, Putin's teams were weaponizing the internet itself. They studied American social media behavior, identified the topics that generated the most passionate responses, and then amplified the most divisive voices on all sides. The goal wasn't to promote specific policies, it was to undermine Americans' faith in their own democratic institutions. Now, you might be wondering, has Putin's master plan worked? The answer is complicated, and it depends on how you measure success. Russia today is certainly more influential globally than it was in 1999. Putin has survived longer than any Russian leader since Stalin, and he's positioned Russia as an indispensable player in multiple global conflicts and negotiations. But there have been significant costs and setbacks too. The 2022 invasion of Ukraine revealed serious weaknesses in Russia's military and economy that Putin's propaganda had hidden even from his own advisors. NATO, which Putin had hoped to divide and weaken, has actually expanded and strengthened in response to Russian aggression. And Russia's economy, while more resilient than many expected, remains heavily dependent on energy exports and vulnerable to international sanctions. What's perhaps most important for you to understand is that Putin's strategy was never just about Russia. It was about fundamentally changing the global order that has existed since World War II. For decades, American leadership of international institutions, alliances, and norms seemed permanent and natural. Putin's achievement has been to demonstrate that this order is neither permanent nor natural. It requires constant effort and commitment to maintain. This is why understanding Putin's playbook matters for your daily life. The inflation you experienced in recent years? Partly driven by global supply chain disruptions caused by the Ukraine conflict. The political polarization tearing at American society? Amplified by information warfare techniques that Putin's strategists pioneered and exported worldwide. The challenges America faces in dealing with China, Iran, and other rivals? They've all learned lessons from Putin's successes and failures. Looking ahead, Putin's plan is entering what might be called Phase 5, adaptation and evolution. The 2022 Ukraine invasion, regardless of how it ends, has already forced him to recalibrate his strategy. Russia is more isolated from the West than at any time since the Cold War, but it's also more deeply integrated with China, India, and other non-Western powers than ever before. What makes this story so compelling is that it's still being written. Putin's ultimate goals, restoring Russia as a great power, ending American global dominance, creating a multipolar world order, remain unchanged, but the tactics are constantly evolving in response to new challenges and opportunities. The next chapter of this story involves artificial intelligence, space warfare, Arctic competition, and technological decoupling between democratic and authoritarian blocs. Putin's strategists are already working on how to position Russia advantageously in these emerging domains of competition. But here's the twist that even Putin might not have fully anticipated. His success in challenging American dominance has also awakened American strategic thinking in ways that hadn't been seen since the Cold War. The 2017 National Security Strategy was the first in decades to explicitly acknowledge that America was in strategic competition with rivals like Russia and China. Putin's actions have reminded Americans that their global position isn't guaranteed. It requires active defense and smart strategy. This brings us to perhaps the most fascinating question of all. What would success actually look like for Putin's master plan? Is it the collapse of NATO, American withdrawal from global leadership, Russian dominance over Eastern Europe and Central Asia? Or is it something more subtle, simply proving that alternative models of governance and international order are viable? The truth is, Putin's plan has already achieved something remarkable. It has made the unthinkable thinkable. 25 years ago, the idea that Russia could challenge American global leadership seemed absurd. Today, it's the central organizing principle of international relations. But here's where this story takes an unexpected turn, and why you need to stay tuned for what comes next. Because while we've been focusing on Putin's strategic brilliance, there's another player in this game who has been quietly developing an even more ambitious plan. One that could make Putin's two-decade strategy look like small thinking. I'm talking about Xi Jinping's China and the 100-year marathon strategy that American intelligence officials are only now beginning to understand. The intersection of Putin's Russia and Xi's China represents the greatest challenge to American global leadership since World War II. And the most shocking part? The strategies they're using were partially inspired by studying America's own rise to power. They've taken the American playbook and adapted it for the 21st century. Next week, I'll be revealing how China's master plan makes Putin look like he's playing checkers, while Xi is playing 3D chess. You'll discover why American strategists are calling this the most serious threat to democratic values and Western prosperity in modern history. And I'll show you exactly how this affects your job, your investments, and your children's future in ways you probably haven't considered. Make sure you're subscribed with notifications on, because this story is about to get much more personal for every American. The game Putin started is entering its final phase, but the real battle for the future of global power is just beginning.